Okay, so in the previous section, we were able to bring it all together, test out our API, at least the health endpoint, and everything seems to be working quite well. The next thing I would like us to touch up, so if we go back to the README we had over here, we've taken care of APIs, taking care of our handlers, taking care of having our utility functions, our types. So the next thing, of course, linting, because I provided like a Golang YAML. That's basically you would have to have in the root of the project, and you can, of course, also install Golang run to be able to, of course, use this configuration from the YAML file and then link your code. And the next thing I will need to cover also would be code documentation and, of course, API documentation as quickly as possible. And yeah, we've gone over the tools that we worked with. What I would also, of course, do is to provide a link in the description for these tools so you can go back to read it up if you find it interesting or if it's something you'd want to actually experiment in the future. And I really think you should be able to actually try this out on your own. That's actually how you get yourself familiarized with some of these topics. So quickly so for documentation is actually really pretty straightforward. So we could go to the main file, for example, our main.go, and here that we have this API defined, we could actually add a comment here and would say the API, I would say the current API version, something like this. And for the functions, maybe let's use the ones in this config helpers. So env, we could go to env, for example, and here we could already add some comments. So here we could, the good thing is that if you are adding this comment, it's also really important that the first word you put in here matches the name of this function. So here I should be able to say something like get env, for example, demonstrates maybe how to retrieve an env variable from env variable, maybe period, right? And I could also add a couple more outputs. So you have the option, of course, to add your comments as much as you would want to actually describe what you're doing. And of course, you can also maybe add some examples. So here I could add something like fm.println, and here I add get env, like actually invoking the function, and I say something like app mode, and I provide some defaults, and I say none. And so this would be me invoking the function. And down here, you can add an output. So if you do it this way, this would actually correctly show in the documentation when it is generated. So this is one way you could actually add an example as to how to use this function. But again, remember this comment needs to start with the name of the function to actually get picked up when the comments is being generated. And of course, to write tests against this method, all I need to also do is to come over here, create a new file with the same name as the file I want to test. And then, of course, it has to end with .test. And then go. And then, of course, the name of the package would still be the same as helpers, but it will now be helpers test. And now I can test. Now I can actually test my function. It was called get env. So here I have two options as to what I could do. So I should actually create an example. So this example would be the first, the prefix would of course still be example, and the last part would be the name of the function I want to test. There are also some couple tricks you could use to capture, for example, the type of data and everything. But for now, for this example, this should work quite well. And here we can also do format print line one more time, and we get the function we want to test, get env, and we'll say maybe the app mode again. And of course, we don't have this set, for example. We say we would expect the default would be none, for example, and then we need to again add our output. And we say the output would be none. And so it should be print line. And now we can run the test again. So in essence, examples are also tests. That's really the short story. Actually, examples are themselves tests, and now it's passed. If we run this one that failed one more time, we see that now it's passed. So regarding documentation, like I said, we can actually document our code this way with examples over here, and for tests, we can of course do it this way. And apart from doing it this way, we can of course also use the testing library to the testing library in Go.
So to wrap up the topic of texting, what we have to do, of course, if you remember when we set up our API, we said that when we are developing locally, we would expect a file called app.env, and this file is supposed to hold every of our environment variables. And of course, when we are not in debug mode, when our application is actually running in, then wherever we want to host it, for example, within a Docker container or whatever, we expect that we'll be running the application in release mode, and in that case, we'd expect that we would have all these environment variables injected into the code at runtime. Yeah, so we have our app.env file, and now what we can actually do is to set up our tests. So regarding tests, there are actually a couple of things I would like to say just to give you the perspective as to where I'm coming from. So there are different aspects to our application. So we have the APIs, we have the business logic, and when I mean business logic, for example, I mean some like if you go to accounts, you have like create account. This is actually something that happens within the code. We could actually test this out to see if it actually behaves as we expect. There is really not much going on here, but the point is you could have, of course, a way where we verify, for example, this middleware is an authorized authenticated endpoint. Sorry, this API is an authenticated endpoint, and this API has access to, if you come over here and we see our definition for users, to see for create user, so we have the auth middleware injected and of course the SQL middleware injected. So one thing you could of course test already is if you go to the auth middleware, when we provide an authorization in the header, this should pass through. Of course, now we're not really doing nothing further by say verifying the token. Now we just check if there is something that looks like a token, and then we move on, and that's good enough for us for now. Of course, could simulate different scenarios like where there is no authorization header provided, and of course what should happen. So if there is no authorization header, we expect that something like this should happen. This is also of course something you can test. So we can actually like, of course, the more tests you write, the better. You can actually break down the code as much as you would like it. Test the middlewares independently, test the logic themselves, and of course, you should have it at the back of your mind that if you're, for example, testing this one, if there are dependencies, it's best to actually mock those dependencies so you can actually focus on what you want to test. So one thing is we could test the business logic, like testing our endpoint. The next thing, of course, we could also do is to test the whole to test our APIs, to actually see, for example, if you come here, and say go to users. If we come to this endpoint and provide this, what should happen? If we try to, we can also of course test the database connection and actually maybe even decide to write and delete from an actual database. So there's actually a lot that can happen as long as tests are concerned, and this could span like going from functional testing to unit testing, as the case may be, end-to-end testing if you have an and a front end, if like a user facing component of your application. I'm just gonna jump over to this mock folder and create a file called db. So what I would like to do with this file is basically to mock the database connection. So when I am not testing the database, when I would want to just say test the business logic, I would want to maybe abstract away the whole logic behind database connectivities, queries, and all that, and just focus on what I want to test. And if I want to test the DB itself, I can just go ahead and do it. So this will help me really, really narrow down my test cases. And of course, this should be package mock. Define a function called new. I can call it new database, and it takes nothing, and it's going to return couple of things. Of course, this is of course in relation to the way we set up our DB in the first place. So I would like to return a GOM. I want to return a couple of things. So I want to return a couple of things. So aside from, I would like to return a pointer to, what is this? A pointer to GOMDB, and I would like to return SQL mock, and I will of course return a pointer to SQL. Of course, if you have been following this tutorial, you would understand that we used GOM as a wrapper around our clients when it comes to connectivity to our database. So you could of course refer to this in this context as our ORM. And maybe I would add some comments so it makes a lot more sense to read. So here I could say something like get db and mock, and this is where I would define SQL DB, and I would want to get a mock and of course an error, and this would come from SQL mock, this guy with new. This would return of course 3 things. If you hover over this function, you would see all of this over here. So this is actually how this is set up, and here I can actually pass a couple of configurations. So I can already say this one matcher options, and I would like to pass SQL query matcher this one. Perfect. Yes, and now I can validate my error, and I say if error is not equal to nil, for now I can log that fatal, and I say error initializing SQL mock, and I can say error, and I pass this guy here, and now I have these two. And what I could do, of course, is maybe to defer the closure of our connection to database, but I think this would, of course, really hamper what we're trying to do. So I would let the test case consuming this mock to then take the responsibility of closing the connection. And I can, of course, set up a dialector, and this would be my SQL.new. And it would take, of course, my SQL.config. And within the config, the connection would be our SQL DB, and our driver name would be, of course, I'm using my SQL, so this should be my SQL, and that should be our dialector. And maybe what I can do is to, I don't know, to query the version of the database just to make sure to verify connectivity, and here I can define an array of strings that would represent our columns. And so this would be string, and here I'll just say version. And now I can of course test my mock. I could say mock.expect query. So what I would expect is I would expect a query that says select version. I can say then with args, because of course it would take some arguments, the query, and then it will return rows, this one. And of course I need to mock what is actually being returned. I can say mock the new rows, and I pass columns, and of course I can just say from CSV string, and I can maybe just provide say 1 or something like this. And yep, so this at this point of course I would know that the connectivity to my mock is established. And what I can do here is of course then from the database, now I can of course get my DB, and this will be equal to gom.open. I'll pass the dialector, and of course it takes a gom config, not from gom.config. And I can just I can leave this open for now and see if there are any errors, and I can actually call this db error, something like this, and I can say of course if error, if this is not equal to new, and I'm gonna do like I did before, log.fatal, and yeah, just do something similar, error connecting to db with gom, and I provide more information about the error. So error, I can just pass here db error to error. I want to get, because this returns the string of the error. And now what I can do is I have everything I need. I can now return db, I can return mock, and the last is sql db, and that should be fine. So one thing we could already start doing is we can start with testing our APIs. I can create a new file here and I can call it API test.go. And so we can of course use this mock that we created to actually test out our. And yep, so what I would want to do is I would really like to structure this so that I don't repeat myself so much with this test. I could want to define a struct. I can call this API config. Of course, it's going to be a struct. It's going to take a couple of, oh sorry, I did not even define the package. Okay, so of course there are a couple of things that we defined regarding our middleware, and what I would want to do is to mock what can be mocked and then test what can be tested. And I would explain this really so you can understand what I'm trying to do, and then you can of course expand on this and actually write even more sophisticated tests. So I have a couple of middlewares that my API is consuming, and one of them that we defined was the config middleware. And this, we knew it, all of them are actually gene handler func, and so the other one was SQL middleware, the same thing, handler func. And the next one is there was an auth middleware. They all had the same signature. And then we have cause as well, cause middleware handler func. And then I would want to define my router, which is of course be a pointer to a gene engine, and db of course will also be a pointer to a gom.db, and go away. And the last thing for now will be my mock so that I don't repeat myself all the time. SQL mock. I think that's actually all we need when it comes to defining our API config. And now what I would want to do is to initialize the test case and then see how we can actually initialize this, provide all of this information, and then pass this around to all our test cases without having to repeat ourselves all the time. So I can define our init. I can call this init. I say API test, and this is where I pass the things I actually need to initialize this API config struct. So I take a pointer to gomdb. I'll take a router, of course, which would be like a pointer to gene engine, and I think that's it. And then other things I can define, and then I return API config. And so here my config would be this. This is where I can now maybe define some of those middlewares actually. So I can call this func. Of course, here it takes a pointer to a gene context. Takes a pointer to a gene context, and it actually returns a function that takes a pointer to gene context. And this is where we can define, basically here I would want to mock what this config middleware does. That's really what I want to do. And here I know that I'm always setting this variable, and I call this app config. And for now, it's nothing, but I just want it to be available in the context, and I just move on to the next middleware without blocking anything at all. So this would pass as my config middleware. And what I'm trying to do, of course, if you come back here and look at middlewares, you would realize, for example, that if we go to config, that we have something like this. But again, I'm trying to mock this whole thing and assume that that is this. That's really what I'm trying to do. So this will be our config middleware, and the next thing I would want to define is, I can call this SQL mid, for example, and it will still be similar to this one. It will be a function, it takes a pointer to gene context, it will return a function, takes a pointer to gene context. I'm always messing this up. So here I'm also setting, it was called SQL client, and here I need to pass the DB. This will be the DB I'm mocking, and I will move to the next middleware, and that's all. And now I can return what I would want to return. So my API config. Now I can say config middleware takes our config. And what else? SQL middleware takes our SQL mid, and auth middleware. For this one, actually, I think it looks okay because there's actually nothing much going on here. So I'm just going to pass that in here also. So it's a middleware, that's auth middleware. And it should look like this. Yes. And what else? Cause middleware, I think I can also use what I defined in our actual application. And what else? Router, I would pass, of course, the router that I'm providing here, and then DB finally would of course be DB as well. And this is how we would initialize our API test, so that am I missing something? So mock, I have to decide. Okay, let's move on anyways, and then we'll actually see if we need it. So I would when I've initialized the API config, here I would want to initialize my database. So this takes a pointer to gom.db, and this would help me to make migration. That's basically what I want to do here. So I can say auto migrate, and I would want to provide the models I defined in this project. In this case, it was just the user model that we defined, and that's it. So this would make migrations for us, and maybe I can also just add a comment here, and I can say migrate schema. So if we had more models, we can just put them all in here, it's fine. And now I would want to start writing the tests. So I can define a function. So I can call this, say something like, of course, I need to start the name as with test. I say test, I say API and points, for example. Of course, it takes pointer to testing. Okay, and now, so I would add comments here so it makes sense. So now the first thing I would want to do is, of course, to create the gene engine as a slash router. I'm gonna say router, and this I would actually use from, I'll use the default configurations for the router. So this will be my router. And then I need a couple of things. I need my DB, I need my mock, and I need my SQL DB. And of course, you guessed it, this will come from the function we defined initially. And then this, now I let this decide when to close the database. So each of the test cases that would consume this mock would determine when they would want to close this connection. So this defer the closure, and then now I can say API config. Let's say this API config would be, say init API test, and I pass DB and I pass router, and I can also pass the mock, and the mock is SQL mock. So I can just copy this and put this in here and put it in here, for example. And so now we have initialized our API test, and the next thing I would, of course, the next thing I would want to do, maybe even here already, is to initialize our DB. So this will auto make our migrations for us. And yeah, that's mostly it. If I wanted to test the user endpoints, it's actually really straightforward. So what I could do is to, I would define the user routes. So I'm basically, again, focusing on just testing the API. So what I would want to do is to more or less define the routes I would want to test, and see if that behaves like the actual one we defined before. So here, like we did again, I could define a group. I could group all my user endpoints, and I say API config. I use the router in here, and I provide a group. So this would, of course, look similar to the one we used when we were working. And I have an endpoint, and this one should be, oh sorry, this together. Say accounts. I think I had accounts, and now I can create all my group them again like we did when we are defining our APIs. So now I've created a group. All our account endpoints will live under this group, and for all of them, maybe what I would want to do is to apply some middlewares like we actually did in the actual application. So I can apply a config middleware. I can apply a, maybe I want an auth. API config auth middleware. And then this should be auth middleware. And maybe I can also add SQL middleware. Yep. So now this is really similar to what we had over here. So I'm creating this group, for example, and then providing this information. That's really what I'm doing. So now we have the group, and what I could do already at this point is maybe to test my creation endpoint. So I can hit this endpoint for post, for creating an account, and it's at /create, and then I pass the of course the logic I would want to test, which is within accounts.create accounts. This should be accounts endpoints, and I'm defining this. And of course, if you want to test everything, again, you can just define all of this and then test everything.